Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'd like to talk about the God of the Gaps. Now, this is a very strange idea, at least to me, because it's very antithetical to Christianity. The basic idea, so far as I can tell, of the God of the Gaps is that there are parts of nature that don't work. And so the gaps between the parts of nature that work are filled by God just miraculously making things happen, even though the parts of nature don't really fit together. Now, I'm not even sure this is a coherent idea, because if something, to give an example, suppose there was no such thing as gravity and God miraculously made everything fall to the ground all the time, consistently, in the same way. How would that be distinct from gravity? That is to say, how would that be distinct from a natural law? And, it's things like this that gave rise to the idea of occasionalism in the Middle Ages and so on. Frankly, I think that's just a rabbit hole. The whole thing is just a strange sort of rabbit hole to go down that at best is antithetical to Christianity and stands a very good chance of simply being incoherent. Now, I don't believe... you sometimes see it presented, and I don't think it would be the gaps in our scientific knowledge are where you find God, with the idea being that, actually nature works just fine in a perfectly natural way, but just where we happen to not be aware of it, that's God, because that would be just outright, straight up incoherent. So I don't think that could possibly be it, what that idea is. Now, I was kind of curious, because, of course, various ideas I talk about, especially if I come anywhere near the subject of wonder, I'll always get a bunch of atheists who then come and talk about the God of the Gaps. Your God of the Gaps argument won't work. And sometimes I bother to actually point out, I never said that. Sometimes they will say this, even if I rather explicitly say that I'm not talking about the God of the Gaps. It's kind of funny. They're obsessed with it, and I find that rather interesting. And so that made me wonder, well, where does this idea even come from? And, granted, Wikipedia is not the best source, but I went and checked its history. And it seems the earliest references they have are in the late 1800s to a Christian saying that this is a stupid idea. And their other references to it are all Christians saying that this is a stupid idea. In fact, I stopped after about the 1950s, but all their citations in the origin of the phrase were all Christians saying this is stupid. And of course, that's a Christian attitude. Our belief is that God made a world that actually works, that nature works. It's a fallen world, so nature is breaking down in some cases, especially human nature, hence things like sin and so on. But even there are ways in which it can be breaking down even a little bit more broadly than that. That I don't want to get into, but suffice it to say, with angelic and demonic powers and so on, the world may well be a complicated place. Let me just leave it at that. But the Christian idea is nonetheless that fundamentally the world works, and that in any event where you see the world not working, this is the result of creatures not doing what they should do, not of the world being fundamentally misdesigned. So this is an idea that a Christian would find repugnant. It just doesn't make any sense from a Christian perspective. So why are so many atheists so obsessed with this idea, that they see it like a boogeyman all over the place? And I got to thinking, well, the odd thing about it, I find it repugnant as a Christian, since it's basically an insult to God. But the form of the argument, if it weren't about God as Christians understand God, might actually work, oddly enough. And here's a good analogy that I think will show how this could work for a non-Christian idea of God. Suppose that you had several characters in a book who are arguing with each other over whether or not the book they are in contains an author. Okay, so one of them could say, well, look at this plot hole. Remember when, you walked into the room even though you knew that this was a stupid idea anyway? Or, remember that other time when you decided to go and try out the drugs even though you knew it was an insane idea and you would never ever do something like that? And yet, here we are, doing this strange thing that a reader might find interesting, all because you did this thing wildly out of character. That plot hole points to the fact that even though this world is not consistent, or, when the Space Ninjas showed up and were able to teleport, even though nothing heretofore had said they could teleport. And there were like 35 other things they would have done that would have made sense, differently had they been able to teleport then. Now they can. None of these things are internally consistent. We clearly don't live in a book that is internally consistent. Since it's not internally consistent, the consistency must be found elsewhere, and that place where that consistency is found elsewhere is in the author, who can't write the book we're in very well. And so when he needs something to happen, even though he didn't write a book that led up to it, he just makes it happen anyway. See, you can clearly see that we have to have an author because there's no internal consistency to the story that we're in, so it must be an external consistency, and the author is that repository of the external consistency. This all men call author. Okay, that, which is radically unlike a Christian position, would work. I mean, that's a fairly decent argument for some characters in a book to show that there's an author, because of course you could imagine them going like, oh, which of the words that make us up is the author? Point to one of these words, because everything we interact with are words in this book. Where is the author here? And so, that author of the plot holes could well be a pretty good argument in this strange situation. Now, that's because the author doesn't know what he's doing. The author's incompetence points to the existence of the author in this sort of argument. And I think that would actually work. I mean, I haven't thought about it too much, because frankly, I don't really... It's not very relevant to my life. It's interesting, though, and this may be why it is that so many atheists are so obsessed with this idea that they see it all over the place where it isn't. Sort of jumping at shadows of the God of the Gaps, as it were. Because they kind of intuitively... many atheists, and in my experience, the ones who do go for this, tend to have this sort of view of God like another creature in time who is imperfect and who does things like literally changes his mind and literally gets confused, literally has contrary desires, and so on. So they take it all, kind of like the old Greek gods or like the Norse gods, where they're very much like people, just more powerful. And because they conceive of God in this sense, that sort of God could be pointed to by God of the Gaps. I mean, granted, the gods up on Mount Olympus are still within the world, but even there's Zeus was in some sense the sky, and in some sense Zeus, and so on, and Gaia was the earth, but also the goddess, and so on. So it gets a little complicated, but it's not like modern atheists have any sort of decent understanding of ancient Greek mythology or ancient Norse mythology anyway. Thor wasn't the sky, etc. But it's not like they understand any of those mythologies, so, they probably have a fairly cartoonish view of these things, and that's kind of their same view they have, I believe, at least in the ones in my experience. I'm curious about other people's experience of God, and that sort of God could be pointed to by that sort of God of the Gaps argument. There are other possible explanations, of course. Lots of people love to beat up a straw man, especially extremely weak people who, couldn't land a punch on anything but a bunch of straw in a shirt. I'm not so sold on that one. It's been suggested when I was talking with friends about this. Another suggestion is that they already do have a God of the Gaps. It's called science. With a big capital S, scientism, more properly speaking. That is to say, an idol which they have constructed, which bears some resemblance to the actual, process of investigating the natural world we call science, that used to be called natural philosophy. Again, I'm not super sold on that one. It may have some explanatory power, because of course scientism is clearly a thing. There are lots of people who know next to nothing about science, but who have this sort of reverential worship for it, almost to the point of wanting to know nothing about it. So, maybe there's a little bit there, and so they see something that questions whether or not science knows everything, and it makes them, because their idol is being profaned, and so they freak out, and it's just a weapon to hand they've heard of is God of the Gaps, and so they grab up the God of the Gaps hammer and start hitting until the profaning of the idol stops. I'm not super fond of this idea, theory, this explanation. It may have some explanatory power. So anyway, I'd be really curious to hear other ideas on why on earth we keep hearing about, we being, Christians who talk about things like wonder and nature and so on, keep hearing atheists talking about the God of the gaps when that's literally antithetical to Christianity and not something any serious Christian, any serious Orthodox Christian has ever suggested, because it would be not only stupid, it'd be heretical. The God so described would not be the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It would not be, the Christian Trinity that pre-existed all time, and through him all things came to be. It's a completely different idea. It'd be horrifically heretical, which makes it very strange to get accused of it. So I'm really interested in other ideas, and until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.